Hello, everybody. This is Dr. G. Hello, everybody. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. G, but I just had to say hi. As I was saying, I am in the Burton Public Library in beautiful Burton, Ohio, and we are reading Melissa by Alex Gino. Again, this is a wonderful tale about a person who is thinking about and processing gender identity. This chapter is chapter 3 called Acting is Just Pretend. George lived in the left side of a 2-unit house with Mom and Scott. When George referred to her family, Mom and Scott were usually who she meant. Dad lived with his new wife, Fiona, in a house in the Pennsylvania Pocono Mountains, a few hours away. Scott and George visited every summer for 2 weeks, like sleepaway camp. Dad made a better part time father than a full time one. Mr. and Mrs. Williams lived in the other half of the house. They were a retired couple whose ventures outdoors generally consisted of a daily slipper clad shuffle to pick up the paper and mail. George found himself calm and likable. George found them calm and likable and hoped they never moved away. If a new family moved in next door, they might have a boy her age. Then Mom would expect George and the boy to be best friends. You two will have so much fun, Mom would say. Just introduce yourself and smile. Mom was smart, and George loved her a lot, but Mom didn't know about boys. Boys didn't like George, and George wasn't so sure that she thought of what she thought about them either. George walked her bike from the shed to the backyard, along the cracked cement path and up to the street. It was Sunday afternoon, and Kelly had invited her over to practice for Monday's auditions. Kelly said they had they could take turns playing Charlotte, and George's stomach danced at the idea of reading the spider's words aloud. George biked to Kelly's house, her short afternoon shadow leading the way down the main road. Kelly and her father lived in a 2-room basement apartment, and their front door was really a back door. The backyard was more pavement than grass, though tufts of grass sprouted eagerly through cracks in the concrete. George propped her bike against the back wall of the house, hung her helmet from the handlebar, and guided herself down the 3 treacherously steep concrete steps, holding on to the thin metal railing for support. She knocked hard on the wooden door to compete with the rock music blasting inside. Kelly greeted her with a giant smile. The apartment opened directly into a large, messy room. Kitchen appliances and a sink filled with dishes lined one wall. In another corner sat an unmade daybed. Cardboard boxes were stashed everywhere. Piles of books and papers were stacked up everywhere they would fit, on the desk, on the bookcases, in shoeboxes above the bookcases, on top of the TV, pouring out of the open closet. George had even seen sheet music peeking out from a freezer a few times. Kelly had said that was for when her dad needed to let a piece of music cool down before he could work on it some more. Sounds like a joke to me. A single lamp, a single standing lamp attempted to light the room, but the corners of the apartment were encased in shadows. Kelly's father was can you guess it? Yep, a musician. But he didn't play on stage very often. Instead, he wrote music for other people to perform. Kelly swore the people her dad had written for were famous, but George never recognized their names. When Kelly came over to George's for dinner, she loved to rattle off the singers and bands to George's mom, who recognized a few. Today, Kelly's father sat in the middle of the floor, his eyes intent on the paper in his hands. He was surrounded by dozens of stacks of sheet music stretched across the room, both loose and bound into books. Some of the stacks were over 2 feet tall. He added the page he was holding to a pile behind him that looked ready to topple. My dad's cleaning, Kelly announced. What do you think? Wow, said George. That seemed to cover the extent of the damage. Got to mess it up before you can fix it up, Kelly's dad yelled over the music. He picked his way over to the stereo to turn down the volume. Hey, George. Hey, George never knew what to call Kelly's father. Mr. Arden was too formal for a person like him, but George felt funny calling an adult by his first name, even though he had said, Call me Paul, more than once. To George, he was just Kelly's dad, but she didn't think he really wanted to be called that. So you are here to be a big time actor? He asked as he lifted a box off a pile and added it to the mess on the ground. I guess so, said George. Come on, let's get started. Kelly took George by the hand and walked her across the stained beige carpet to the door of her room. Have fun with your project, Dad. Knock if you need us and try to keep it down. We've got lines to rehearse, and you know how important those are. Yes, ma'am. George's father gave a firm nod and returned his attention to the next piece of sheet music on the pile in front of him. Walking inside Kelly's room was like entering another world. The desk and bureau were spotless. Her bed was neatly made, and dozens of framed photographs hung stylishly on the walls. Each vacuum lines streaked, not each, excuse me, fresh vacuum lines streaked across the rose pink carpeting, and the air smelled like lemons. Wow, Kelly, your room's even neater than usual. I went on a cleaning binge. It's what inspired my dad. Maybe you should give him lessons. Ha! He thinks he finding lost stuff is half the fun. He says it's like digging for gold. Anyway, I think you've got a great idea. What idea? Trying out for Charlotte. Mrs. Udell will love that you care so much about the character that you want to play her on stage, even though she's a girl and you're a boy. Plays are all about pretending, right? Hmm, was all George could say. Playing a girl part wouldn't really be pretending, but George didn't know how to tell Kelly that. Besides, it was hard to stop Kelly once she got started. Mom said that Kelly should be a lawyer. Kelly said her dad would sue her if she tried. You know, Kelly continued, she'll probably give you the part just to make the point. She's always going on about how we're not supposed to let people's expectations limit our choices. Seems like a super important line that I just read. How we're not supposed to let people's expectations limit our choices. I think that has a lot to do with gender and how we present ourselves as which gender we want to be. I think that's important here. But it's not only gender, is it? Could be really anything in life. Anyway, but it's more than just the play, George tried to explain. Of course it is. There's a whole history of boys playing girls in theatre. Get it? In theatre, in theater. Did you know that all the characters in Shakespeare's plays were played by men, even the girl parts? Even when they had to kiss? Can you believe it? George thought for a moment about kissing a boy, and the idea made her tingle. Living in Shakespeare's time didn't sound so bad, even if you had to poop outdoors. Kelly went on. Romeo and Juliet were both played by boys. Boys, just think. William Shakespeare himself might have played Juliet. If you want to be Charlotte, you should get to try out. like anyone else. It's only fair. And if you get nervous, my dad says you just have to picture the audience naked. That's true. I've heard that before, although I've never tried that. George didn't see how that would help, Kelly said. Kelly, she said, yeah, your dad is weird. I know that. Kelly stood in the center of the room and took a few bows as if she were on stage. She looked around nervously and then pointed at her imaginary audience, yelling, how can I act in front of you people? You're all naked. This is extremely rude. Kelly started to giggle. George joined her until the two of them curled into howling balls of laughter, occasionally shouting things like, I can't perform under these conditions. Where's my limo? And give me my agent, until finally, winded and with sore cheeks, their chuckles grew further apart. Suddenly, Kelly jumped up, determination in her face. Okay, let's get to work. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside, a rainbow of hanging file folders kept numerous papers in place. Kelly took a pair of pages from a file in the front, then rolled the drawer shut. I made a copy on my dad's printer last night. Kelly thrust a page at George. The word Charlotte stood in capital letters on the top, originally written with a thick marker. Below it was the first conversation between Charlotte and Wilbur. All of the girls, no matter what part they wanted, would be auditioning with Charlotte's lines, and the boys would be auditioning with Wilbur's. Why don't you place Charlotte first? Kelly dropped to her hands and knees, laying her script on the carpet in front of her. She oinked up to George, who perched himself as high as she could on the pillows at the head of the bed. As they acted out the scene, George surprised herself. She thought she would be nervous, but it seemed natural to say Charlotte's words out loud. They were finished too quickly. Switch places, Kelly called, flopping onto the bed and laying on her back with her head hanging off the side. She held the paper out at arm's length in front of her, upside down so she could read it. Ready? She called. George climbed off the bed and sat cross-legged on the floor. She read Wilbur's lines and heard Kelly echo back the words she had read aloud moments ago. George was delighted when it was time to switch back. She climbed majestically up to the peak of the bed, limbs, stretched her limbs out like a spider's, while Kelly jumped onto the floor and snorted. Salutations, George cried, and the scene began again. The words felt good on her lips. The two friends ran the dialogue back and forth until they could say almost all the lines without looking at the page. Eventually, Kelly refused to give up her spot as Wilbur, and George happily repeated the role of Charlotte. You don't mind? Asked George. She could have read Charlotte's words all day long. I'm having fun, Kelly said. Besides, you make a better Charlotte than I do. I keep goofing up the first line. Kelly was right. She kept saying salutations instead of salutations. Salutations was the fancy way Charlotte first greeted Wilbur and showed off her magnificent vocabulary. It was an important first line. There were other parts. I could be Fern. I'll be all pa. Where are you going with that axe? She held up her hand in imaginary protest. Axe? What axe? Kelly's father had opened the door and popped his head in. I ain't got no axe. I'm strictly a bass man. Da-dum, 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 dum, dum. He slapped his fingers against his waist, playing an imaginary instrument. Get it? Axe? Bass? Really, Dad? Kelly gave her father a look. George smiled blankly. Kelly turned to George. Hotshot lead guitarists like to call their guitars axes. It makes them think they're cool. She refocused her attention on her father. Didn't I tell you to knock first? We're trying to rehearse. You've been at it a while. I thought you might be thirsty. There's white grapefruit juice in the fridge. Well, in that case, my dear father, Kelly proclaimed, I don't mind you bothering us at all. Why, with all this rehearsing, I'm downright parched. I'll bet your co host is too, Miss Arden. What do you say, Mr. Mitchell? Care for a beverage? George nodded. She hated being called Mr. Mitchell. She wanted to shout, Mr. Mitchell lives in the Poconos with a woman named Fiona. Mr. Mitchell was her dad's name. It would be her brother Scott's name someday too, but it would never be hers. Instead, George followed Kelly into the main room of the apartment and over to the fridge, where Kelly poured juice into two plastic cups that had come from a local barbecue shack. Most of the dishes in the cabinets were made of plastic. There were a few real glasses at the back of the shelf, the remnants of several different sets, but no one ever seemed to use them. Given how often cups were knocked over in the Arden house, this was probably a good idea. Kelly gulped her juice down in 3 swallows. Ah, white grape juice, my favorite. She wiped her hand across her mouth, added the cup to the pile of dishes, filling the sink, and set herself in the empty space on the floor where her father had been sitting among the chaos of paper. She oinked several times and pushed the nearest piles carefully out of her way and before rolling onto her back and rocking back and forth. A pig gleefully wallows in mud. Kelly's father snatched her cup from the top of the dish pile and poured a glass of grapefruit juice for himself. He chuckled at his daughter's antics. Are you going to say that my room is a pigsty? Kelly oinked and nodded vigorously. Kelly's dad turned to George. Care to stay for dinner? I'm making super special surprise. Thanks, but I think my mom wants me home. As you wish. Kelly took her best friend by the hand and escorted her back to her room. They ran through their lines once more. George would have liked to play the role of Charlotte all day, but Kelly declared boredom and pulled out her camera. The camera was small and silver with a lens in the front that zoomed in and out. She had gotten it for her birthday last summer, and there hadn't been a day since that she hadn't taken a picture of something. She loved framing the shot, deciding just where the picture should start and what should stay unseen. Some of the photographs on her walls were portraits, one of Kelly's dad on stage playing his bass, another of her Uncle Bill painting in a field of dandelions like a hippie, and a grainy photo of a tall, dark skinned woman in heels and a shiny blue dress holding a microphone. It was the only picture on the wall that Kelly hadn't taken herself. And while she almost never talked about it, George knew it was a photo of Kelly's mom. Not all of the pictures were of people Kelly knew, though. There was a kid smiling on the monkey bars, a man in a suit drinking coffee while deep in thought, and an old couple holding hands on a park bench. Other photos were images of everyday objects so close up that you could barely tell what they were anymore. There was a worn down pencil eraser, a pile of Q tips, the string of a guitar, and a shadowy shape with a shimmering silver triangle in the middle. Even Kelly didn't remember what that object had originally been, but it was George's favorite. Kelly distracted Kelly directed George to stand against the back of the door and began to shoot. Put your left foot in front of your right, she told George. George did, but Kelly frowned. Nah, put it back. She took a few more shots. Look up to the sky. No, not like you're looking at a plane, like you're looking at a leaf on a tree. George didn't mind so much when Kelly took a few pictures of her, but she hated it when Kelly tried to pose her. Kelly was persistent, though, and it was faster to let her take her pictures than to argue with her, lose, and have Kelly take even more pictures to prove her point. Kelly modeled George with a book and a shot close up and shot close ups of the spaces between her fingers. She gave George a baseball cap and sunglasses to wear and took pictures until George couldn't take it anymore and begged her to stop. What if we take some outside? Kelly asked. Nah, George replied. I gotta get home. Fine. Anyway, better go before my dad announces that super special surprise is ready and insists that you stay. What is super special surprise anyway? My dad fries up a bunch of leftovers. Occasionally it's awesome. Usually it's so so. And sometimes it's so bad we have to order pizza. That's funny. George said goodbye to Kelly and walked her bike up the cracked path along the house. Two, one, two, three, Kelly called out from the basement window. Zoot! George yelled into the early evening air. She strapped on her helmet and began the familiar ride home. Houses passed in a blur while Charlotte's words continued to roll through her mind. I want to show you this part of the book. You see these three dots? It's not that there's the beginning of a new chapter, but the author put those in probably to show there's a major change coming up in the story. And this paragraph starts with the words at home. So I'm thinking that the author has put those three dots in to show that there's a change in the scene. We just left um, the house of Kelly, and now we're going to the house of George. At home, Mom was staring at the open pantry cabinet, her long, dark brown hair back in its usual ponytail. She wore a polo shirt and blue jeans, the same clothes she wore under her white lab coat at work every day. She preferred jeans to skirts and didn't wear makeup. She said it wasn't good for your skin, and besides, women were beautiful enough the way they were. Indeed, Mom was beautiful. She was tall with a kind, genuine smile and had the same bright green eyes as George. Hey, Gigi, she said as she shut the pantry door. When George was little and couldn't say her name properly, she used to call herself Gigi. Mom still called her that, even though Scott said that it sounded like a girl's name. George secretly thought the same thing. Have you seen your brother? Mom asked as she rustled through the fridge for dinner options. He went to Randy's house. Hot dogs and beans okay? Hot dogs and beans it is. Scott hated baked beans, but both George and her mother loved them. While Mom made dinner, George headed upstairs to take a bath. She took off her shirt while the tub filled, waited until the last possible moment to take off her pants and underwear. She immersed her body in the warm water and tried not to think about what was between her legs. But there it was, bobbing in front of her. She washed her hair with lots of shampoo so that the suds would cover the surface of the water. She scrubbed her body, stood with a splash, and dried off with the fuzzy blue towel. When she wrapped the towel around her torso up to her armpits, the way girls do, and ran a small black comb through her hair, she brushed it forward and stared at her pale, freckled face in the mirror before combing it back into its regular part down the middle. In her room, George changed into a pair of flannel pajamas covered in tiny penguins wearing red bow ties. Mom called that dinner was ready, and George went downstairs to eat. Mom already sat at the kitchen table getting ready to take a bite of her hot dog, which was covered in mustard and relish. She had toasted her bun, but had left George's soft and cool, just the way she liked it. Thanks, Mom, George said. She squirted some ketchup onto her hot dog and took a steamy, juicy bite. They ate in silence at first. Scott was usually the one who talked the most at dinner, but a question was burning in George's mind. Over and over it played. Mom, she said after she swallowed the last bite of her hot dog. She barely realized she had spoken aloud. What's up, Gigi? George stopped. It was such a short little question, but she couldn't make her mouth form the words. Mom, what if I'm a girl? George had seen an interview on television a few months ago with a beautiful woman named Tina. She had golden brown skin, thick hair with blonde highlights, and long, sparkling fingernails. The interviewer said that Tina had been born a boy, then asked her whether she'd had the surgery. The woman replied she was a transgender woman and that what she had between her legs was nobody's business but hers and her boyfriend's. So George knew it could be done. A boy could become a girl. She had since read on the internet that you could take girl hormones that would change your body, and you could get a bunch of different surgeries if you wanted them and had the money. This was called transitioning. You could even start before you were 18 with pills called androgen blockers that stop the boy hormones already inside you from turning your body into a man's. But for that, you needed your parents' permission. Now, this part of the book is important because we're finally at the stage where George is thinking to himself that he is contemplating what it would be like not to have boy parts and not to turn into a man. And the author of this book is giving us the right language to use to talk about this. George, whatever it is, you can tell me. Mom took George's hand in one of her own and covered it with the other. Whatever happens in your life, you can share it, and I will love you. You will always be my little boy, and that will never change. Even when you grow up to be an old man, I will still love you as my son. George opened her lips, but there were no words in her mouth and only one thought in her brain. No. George knew that Mom was trying to help, but George didn't have a normal problem. She wasn't scared of snakes. She hadn't failed a math test. She was a girl, and no one knew it. Mom, could I have some chocolate milk? Oh, Gigi, of course. She went to the fridge. In the weeks after Dad had left the house, Mom had given George a glass of chocolate milk every night before bed. Neither of them would say anything. Neither of them had anything to say, but these were some of George's favorite memories, just sitting there, being with Mom, knowing she would never leave. George wouldn't finish her chocolate milk until she was ready for Mom to kiss her goodnight. Then Mom would take the nearly empty glass and turn it over above her mouth for one last drop. George always made sure to leave the last thick sip. Now Mom came back to the table with a full glass of chocolate milk, frothy with fresh stirring. The sweetness filled George's mouth. She focused her eyes firmly on the creamy bubbles, now resting halfway down the glass. She stared at the foam for a minute and then down the second half. She felt more than tasted it, coldness running down her throat. Then she handed the glass to Mom, who tipped it over her tongue for that last final drop. The sweetness of the chocolate milk had coated George's tongue, covering the words sitting on its tip. Someday, somehow, George would have to tell Mom that she was a girl. But this was not that day. And as for now, she had no idea. And as for how, she had no idea. And that's the end of chapter 3. Some things to think about.